Welcome back to Tritium. This is part 3 of the build log, and you can see that I've skipped ahead a lot here. I've now completed the case mods, the custom paint, I've assembled the GPU loop, and I'm now filling it. I still need to complete the CPU loop. Now the way I'm filling this loop is totally experimental. This is not the way that I actually end up doing it, but this is one of the big challenges with this loop. Due to the very unique pump and reservoir configuration, fill and drain are the biggest challenges that I had with this loop, but we'll get to that shortly. So coming back to the case mods and the custom paint, I'd actually completed all of it, and then we decided to upgrade from 360mm to 420mm radiators, which you can do with this case by purchasing a couple of add-on panels, the Hexgear R80. Now, normally I would say we are just way overboard with radiator capacity, fans, flow these days. So if this were a single loop for the 1950X and the SLI GTX 1080 Ti's, I would have said that the two 360mm radiators would have been enough, because you're not often going to end up with a situation where all of those components are at 100% load, but even if you did, it would be enough. Now, if it were thin radiators, EKSE 30mm thick radiators, not quite enough. And this is just my own opinion from my own experience. Black ice radiators, yes, definitely. The performance is incredible. But if the case fits 420mm radiators, then why not? And because we are splitting the loops in half into 2 loops, particularly the SLI 1080 Ti's with the overclocking that we are going to be doing, this was a very important upgrade in my opinion. The 420mm radiators, it doesn't sound like much of an increase, but if you do the math, there is quite a lot of extra surface area, even from a 240 to a 280. So I had to redo the case mods and some of the custom paint again, but we were able to stick with the original design and ideas. I only needed to change some of the measurements. And because this case is one of those extremely rare cases that is actually designed by people who have done liquid cooling before, who understand liquid cooling, I was able to do all of the case mods in this case with just a single panel. If you look at the mid-tower systems that I often build, you'll see that I'm modifying every single panel in the case just to get the build to fit the components that it says in the specifications that the case is supposed to fit. You know, I'm doing 8-10 modification panels, but a single panel in this case is the PSU shroud, cable routing panel, the motherboard tray shroud to clean up the motherboard tray area. It's the mounting surface area for the pump and reservoir configuration, which is the central main feature of Tritium, representing Tritium, the single proton and 2 neutrons, which is what the 3 Bitspower reservoirs represent. So getting to the loop in this case is obviously the main feature, the most important part of the build. And the pump and res configuration, this was the big challenge. Now, it wasn't actually a challenge overall just to install these components, because the modifications, as you can see, it's just a single panel. The loops are fairly basic, as you can see. There's not even much tube. This configuration actually allowed me to install, less tube, shorter loops. It cleaned up the loops overall. And, that's what these reservoirs are about. They give you all of these inlet-outlet options, and that's what we've done with our components as well. The Protium pump top gives you a lot of extra inlet-outlet options, and this makes loop building easier. It gives you more options, and so that wasn't the problem. It was the fill and drain ports, because that is something that customers always ask for. Now, despite the fact that I'm always installing fill and drain ports, I'm not a huge fan of them. But if you can install a fill port or a drain port without it impacting on the aesthetics, without installing a whole lot of extra fittings, then why not? But, if you have to add a whole lot of extra mess just for something you're only going to use a couple of times in the lifetime of the build, then that is definitely not something that I like to do. And for this build, with the pump and res configuration being such an important part of the aesthetics, there was no way I was going to ruin that by adding these incredibly complex fill and drain ports. And so there were so many different ideas that I came up with, most of them impacting on aesthetics. So there were 3 that I ended up deciding on testing. One of them was, this case is symmetrical. You know, you can turn that upside down. It's the same top and bottom. So I thought, well, maybe we can use the drain ports as the fill ports just by tipping the build upside down. So I tried this, but it kept recirculating air. The other problem that we have here, we are breaking a lot of the laws of liquid cooling here. Now, you can break the rules of liquid cooling, but then things are not really going to work like they're supposed to. Now, there are small sacrifices that I am more than willing to make for the sake of a theme and aesthetics. And, you know, that's kind of what I was thinking here with the fill and drain ports. So we already have a small reservoir volume, which is a problem because it means the air takes longer to come out. You know, compared to a nice big tube reservoir, it keeps the air in the loop in small bubbles, lemonade, and it just keeps recirculating the air. Eventually it will come out with a small volume. The smaller the volume, the longer it takes. And it gets to the point where if the volume's too small, you just can't get the air out at all. And so these reservoirs generally mean, you know, an extra hour kind of to get the air out. You add to that a fill port that's not perfectly placed, and it's just impossible. So then I tried the old T-line option, installing a reservoir temporarily onto the top of the pump tops. That was kind of the same problem, although a little bit better. So then I resorted to what was kind of my final resort, although it was the option that I liked the most, but I wanted to try the simple options first that were not going to impact at all on the aesthetics. Installing a fill port into the tops of the reservoirs and laying the build flat to fill it. This means that the fill ports are at the highest point with this mod. It's only drilling a hole and tapping a thread, and you can see this is what I ended up doing. Just a 20mm extension fitting brings it up to the highest point, and this worked out very nicely. This loop does take now about 30 minutes extra to fill compared to the average, you know, typical tube reservoir loop, but yeah, quite a minimalistic approach to the fill ports and also the drain ports. The drain port for the CPU loop is at the lowest point, not quite for the GPU loop, but that's very common. So I was happy with the way this worked out. So I've modified all 3 reservoirs, also the one to divide the loops in half.